Hello and welcome to Stories Read and Written by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to listen to more stories read by me, then you can find a link to that in the description of this video. This is a second opinion. Daniel had a habit of making other people's lives his own. If a friend said in an offhand way what they were getting their kids for Christmas or informed him of their holiday plans, he gave it more thought than they had. More thought than they had previously held to be possible. He had traveled and had read widely. He had done so much in his life that he was a repository for whatever they needed. He seemed to know everything about anything, and his friends believed this because his thoughts and theirs moved in roughly the same orbit. He liked to have them over for an afternoon on the weekend, and for the evening too if their conversation lasted that long. His friends brought a little something for him when they visited, bottles of wine or something of that nature. Daniel repaid their generosity by sharing their gifts with him, which is why he preferred they bring food and drink. They ate out in his backyard on the big table near his garden that could seat six people and sometimes did. In case of a rain shower, he had umbrellas standing by. He had planted 2 trees, one at each end of his backyard. They sat at the perimeter like sentries and ensured a happy medium in warm and in cool weather, whichever way the wind blew. Best of all, they guaranteed privacy. The ingenuity of using trees as fences continually astounded his friends. Hearing their compliments, Daniel told them they were giving him more credit than he deserved. He didn't know much. What he did know he could put to use. It was a simple idea, one which only Daniel had the will and the space to realize. His friends had their likes and dislikes, and Daniel had his. There was a third category to his tastes, what he ate and drank when it was there, and which he had no interest in when it wasn't. His friends were firmer in their tastes than he was in his. They bought gifts to suit themselves, knowing that he would take what they offered if they were there to share it with him. When their stomachs were full and the hour was late, before the bottle was empty, his friends left him with what they didn't finish. The thought of having to throw it away helped him to get it down, though it didn't change his mind about whether he liked it or not. Some of his friends refused to share what they brought, insisting that he was their host and their gift was for him. This was no problem if their taste overlapped with his. He might not always get it all in one go, as some of them did in his place, but it was gone in time. When their tastes were at odds, the gifts he'd received remained untouched. Time would go by, and as it kept going, it would dawn on him that if he hadn't opened his gift yet, he would never do so. Not wanting it to go to waste, he'd pass it on to his other friends the next time he came to visit, and in an act of supreme confidence, he would tell them who had given it to him. His friends stuck to Daniel's rule of eating what guests gave them as long as they were present. Word would get out about Daniel pawning off his gift, and his friends marked that off their list of what to buy him. He was polite about his feelings. A hard blow was easier to take when the landing didn't stick, and of all the disappointments his friends had so far suffered in their lives, this was one they took with a smile. He gave advice when they asked for it, and only if they asked. Maybe it was the discretion he showed about what wines he liked, and more to the point, the lengths to which he went to spare their feelings. Maybe it was the breadth of what he knew that suggested to his friends he was qualified to give a second opinion about what was bothering them. Maybe it was none of this. The reasons were and would forever be unknown to him. He suspected his friends had something on their minds long before they said so, and he let them figure out for themselves what they wanted to share with him. They had to take the first step and tell him what was wrong and either confirm or deny his suspicions. Had he kept score, he would have felt proud to be near the mark more times than not. As he listened to them, he gave no sign of having weighed his chances. Their lives and their consciences were their own. What I've called a habit of his was really a strong interest in what they said, which he took for his own as he explained how it related to himself. Were theirs? If it was an intimate matter that demanded secrecy from their friends and partners, they spoke to him about it privately over the phone. It made their talks feel like appointments. He liked to meet face to face because that meant they could make a day of it and treat it as an outing. His friends, he believed, should get out of the house instead of being cooped up with their problems. Fresh air and sunshine cured minor ailments and did no harm to the healthy. He encouraged them to meet in person. You can make time if you don't have it, he said, and with enough of this prodding, he got what he wanted. He had carefully chosen his friends to be as sensible as himself. They didn't come to him with questions that were better suited for a specialist. They had accountants for their finances and had doctors for their health, though they favored talking to Daniel or with each other, over paying for a therapist or a marriage counselor or whatever type of professional talker the situation might demand. Those sessions, they assumed, amounted to the same thing as their friendships. What they lacked in expertise and a diploma they made up for in cost. His friends knew what to expect from them, more or less. What they wanted from was a common sense perspective from the outside. Whether that was supporting them in what they had made up their minds to do or to make them reconsider. They gave him questions loaded with ambiguity, whose most definitive and easiest answer, do what's right for you, would have been vague and unsatisfying. Daniel guided them towards something more specific. Their talks could be grave, long-form confessions whose concerns rested on moral grounds. His friends knew he took them seriously and reminded him that it was their cross to bear, not his. He should have been a priest, he thought, assigning the appropriate penance to people's sins and keeping what those sins were to himself, or a traffic cop handing out tickets and fines. He did that already as a hobbyist, free of charge. Their talks could also be, and generally were, light-hearted consultations about their plans for the immediate future or the present. Were they keeping up with the times in their dress and in general? Were they falling short somewhere? If this or that had happened to Daniel, how would he have reacted, and what should they have done? Daniel pushed them to broaden their horizons, and as he listened, a thoughtful expression came over his face. He interrupted them when they repeated themselves, which was rare, to get them out of a rut and to send their thoughts down a more promising path. For all that they asked him, they didn't want him to plan their futures for them, and wouldn't have tolerated it if he had tried to do that out of his own accord. Rather, they wanted him to take from them the weight of a decision whose time was fast approaching or barely gone. Daniel had higher expectations for himself than his friends did. To them, he was someone to confide in, someone with a smart head on his shoulders. He wasn't the only person to whom they could turn. He was glad to hear their lives were carefree, and glad in a convoluted way to hear they had an ordeal for the two of them to tackle. Their questions and his counsel gave their friendships meaning and a sense of solidity. The man in the house to Daniel's right, Malcolm Holmes, had once lived in a much worse place than this, and had Daniel to thank for his new life. Malcolm had made his hatred of what was now his former neighborhood painfully obvious to Daniel whenever they talked. His old house was in such close quarters with the houses of his neighbors that it was, practically speaking, a shack with a strip of unkempt lawn. To hear of Malcolm's view for the place, it was a slum in all but name. If it wasn't one thing, it was another, and it was usually both and more on top of that. One problem followed and compounded the next, making the second a product of the first and inseparable from it too. When a fight broke out, people found their way over to see how it would go. The screams and shrieks of onlookers grew louder and louder as the fight progressed, and the people involved threw their punches wildly, with more anger than skill. If he missed the warning signs of an argument that was escalating and found himself suddenly caught up in a neighborly dispute, he removed himself from the vicinity, pushing, jostling, and weaving through the crowd that sprang up from nowhere, a crowd that got out of his way to get him out of their way. He shut his door and tried to ignore them. He couldn't. Single-paneled windows, double-paneled windows, thin doors and thick doors, the noise got through. Everyone was inconsiderate, and on his worst days, Malcolm thought he was getting to be like them. His head cleared. He got a hold of himself, and he saw how much further he'd have to sink for that to be true. They had no respect for where they lived, or for the people with whom they lived. This irritated him, and made him quietly resentful of his neighbors, who were loudly obnoxious to everyone. One afternoon, he had gone to his next-door neighbor's house to ask them to take responsibility for their dog, to feed it and let it inside the house so it was out of the heat, to give it what it wanted and to stop it from barking. They could live with the consequences of their neglect. He shouldn't have to. This was the speech that he began to deliver as soon as the owner opened the door. Having nowhere to look but at her, he saw that she was bored, and this boredom concealed her displeasure at being called to answer for what she hadn't done. Though their eyes met at one point in his speech, he held his gaze below hers, at or around her nose, for the rest of it. Her body was slouched, her mouth was tilted in a frown. As he spoke, he asked himself whether she was hearing the words he was saying, or just the sounds. She shut the door in his face the moment he stopped talking. He was out of sight and out of her life. It had taken Malcolm's neighbors weeks to realize he'd moved in, and it had taken them months to realize he'd moved out. His whining and door-knocking was proof he was alive and well. But because he kept to himself, unless somebody made that impossible, his departure from the neighborhood made little difference to them. Though he had left them to be beside Daniel, some believed he was living there still. Next, he tried to shut her dog up himself. She didn't seem to think it was her problem. The dog was a big black wrinkled thing he had seen in passing from afar as he went to lecture its owner. It was bigger still up close and dwarfed the post she had tied it to. He felt sorry for the dog and for himself. They were trying to live their lives as best they could, and people were determined to get in their way. Unlike his neighbors, whom he had reported to the police for assault and disturbing the peace to no consequence, the dog wasn't to blame for its misery. It was as powerless to feed itself as Malcolm was to convince its owners to care for it. He went to pet the dog, holding his hand out in front of him to ease it into the presence of a stranger. The dog tensed up and growled as he approached. He backed away, and when he had reached a safe distance, he turned and left the way he came. His feelings for the dog evaporated, leaving behind an explanation for its behavior. Too many people had hurt the dog for it to risk letting him come any nearer. It had growled at him instead of whimpering, as it presumably did when it saw its owners. He didn't hear the dog bark for the rest of the day. He used the calm he had fought for to call Daniel and tell him how unbelievable his neighbors were. Their dogs were as bad as their owners. The neighborhood at large continued to annoy him, and more than usual, as if to make up for the truce he had established. Daniel knew Malcolm wasn't totally clueless, though this was getting harder and harder to believe. Each time they talked, he brought more bad news than good, and he relayed the good news in an unfeeling tone, as if he had heard about it and not lived it, and couldn't be happy for himself, much less for a stranger. Bad news sparked life in him, for better or for worse, rousing him to speak on behalf of what little he had to call his own, to speak and to defend it. With each complaint Malcolm made, Daniel's memory of him ever having been content receded further and further into the past. Daniel knew that Malcolm was telling the truth about the shabbiness of his house and the state of his neighborhood, the last of which was then fast becoming a deciding factor concerning where Malcolm wanted to live. Daniel remembered the time somebody graffitied Malcolm's house. Malcolm had called him to talk about it right after he'd frustrated the police with his lack of specifics on who had done it and when. The officer repeated his questions to make sure Malcolm was giving them everything they asked for, and Malcolm repeated his story to assure the police he was trying his hardest to comply. Someone broke Malcolm's window the next day, and that was what had finally convinced him to buy a security camera, as Daniel had been telling him to do. Malcolm put it high on his roof, giving it a full view of his doorstep and the street that led to it, and giving anyone thinking of pulling a prank on him or smashing up the place a full view of the camera, as well as second thoughts about what they were there for. Malcolm had told him, coolly, of his plans to secure his home. He should have seen it coming, living in a place like this. He hadn't, and it wouldn't happen again. 2 years after that, Malcolm said the broken window was kid stuff compared to how bad it was these days. The examples he cited as evidence for his claim were no more criminal than what he'd shrugged off in the past. The rage that shook his voice as he cursed his neighbors was the belief, now dead, that he could carve out a place of his own. Bit by bit, every crime his neighbors had committed had chipped away at him. Crime was high. It had been that way as far back as Malcolm could remember, give or take some dips in the crime rate no one besides the city officials talked about. The citizens didn't notice. That was why the city's officials talked about it so much, he said. You could be mugged for walking down the street on the one evening you should have stayed home, and it was anyone's guess which evening that would be. The fear of crime was like a curfew the city left to its seediest elements to enforce at random. Every day, somebody was robbed or killed, or was made to endure similar cruelty. Malcolm had no need for a police report statistics. He told Daniel stories of hearing gunshots in the odd hours of the night, which had kept him up, and in the early hours of the morning, which had awoken him with too long a time to go until his alarm clock rang. This was all the evidence Malcolm gave, and all Daniel wanted, more than that even. What Malcolm was asking for was a way out. Daniel said Malcolm could buy a house somewhere he'd be safer. Malcolm said he couldn't afford it. If I could, I would have. You don't have to tell me what I know. I don't like living here any more than you like hearing about it. Daniel had known this was the case, and had said it anyway to broach the subject. In a flash of generosity, he offered to find Malcolm a house and pay for some of it. Daniel had the money to stick to what he said, and a conscience that wouldn't have let him do otherwise. How much the house would cost, and what their share of the price would be, those were concerns they discussed in the months that followed. In that time, he and Malcolm called each other at least weekly to talk about how the house hunt was going, the subject that dominated their lives from that day on. That dominated much of their lives from that day on. Daniel was as involved in this as Malcolm, partly because it was his money on the line, but moreover because he believed in the cause he was supporting. As the list of houses shrank, so too did the number and degree of their differences. Malcolm aspired to have a family. For now, he could live by himself and move into something bigger when the time came, if he decided that's what he wanted. This was a temporary stop, temporary in the sense that it wasn't intended to be where he'd live for the rest of his life. It was crucial that Malcolm have room to himself and distance from his neighbors. In time, more criteria came to mind, and more houses fell out of the running. Eventually, they narrowed themselves down to 2 houses. They were in a price range that Malcolm fit into, with some assistance on Daniel's part. They were small, and despite their size, gave him a quiet place to withdraw to. The neighborhoods they were in were clean and full of people who, taking that cleanliness into account, knew how to behave. Daniel felt the easiest way to choose between 2 options when you didn't know which to take was to flip a coin. You'd know how you felt from your reaction. The point was to heighten the urgency of a decision by letting the coin choose for you. You outsmarted yourself, really. This wasn't foolproof by any means. There were times when all it did was make you feel more ambivalent and torn with greater force between your choices. As luck would have it, that's what it did to Malcolm. It was a success often enough that Daniel kept it in mind and recommended it to friends as the way to a solution, if not as the solution itself, whenever they had been turning something over in their minds for a while. Again, Daniel took the initiative and brought Malcolm's attention to a house right by Daniel's own, a house he was sure he could get a good deal on because he knew the owner. Daniel had since forgotten the man's name, let go of it to make room for Malcolm and for friends who entered his life at around that time or later. They had been acquaintances in the best of times and were nothing nowadays. The man had intended to rent the house out and supplement his income. Each month the house was empty, he had to pay the mortgage out of his own pocket and not the pockets of his renters. In the first 6 months, he expected a swarm of people to break down his door and to have competing offers to choose from. He'd planned to run his renters through a rigorous selection process. The ones who'd make it through were those whose lives were stable, who looked after where they lived and had high salary jobs that meant they could make their payments on time. His expectations dwindled in the next 6 months, which turned out to be his last, as he failed to find anyone. Having held out for as long as he had, he'd had the time it took for him to realize it wouldn't get any better. He and Daniel met as they were getting the mail, which held no surprises for either of them. His mailbox had the bills for the house he lived in and the house nobody wanted. Daniel's mailbox had less to be upset about, and likewise nothing to improve his happiness. He was trying to cut his losses, and thought Daniel could help. Daniel could have given Malcolm over to him as a renter, but that didn't seem right. This was a betrayal of sorts, a lie by omission, which served Daniel better than honesty could. He'd have to sell the house for cheap, the man said. That would get it off his hands and into someone else's. He sighed, said he didn't understand why nobody called, and gave a shrug of defeat. This meant too much to Malcolm for Daniel to let a word of their arrangement get out. He was positively beside himself with how the man's scheme had gone wrong in just the right way. Brimming with excitement, Daniel wasn't sure what to say and said nothing, the best option to take when one sentence can say more than is wise. He discussed this with Malcolm and gave him the address. Malcolm toured the house and called Daniel on the spot. He loved it. He didn't need any tricks to know what he wanted. He and Daniel signed on the dotted line, and with that, Malcolm's troubles were over. Daniel had spent as much time on his own house as he had on Malcolm's, if not more. He had assembled a field of candidates and considered which was truly his favorite. In his search, he accounted for how each house looked at present and for how he could fix them up. His house's previous owner had allowed a dry, yellow, sickly grass to dominate the front and the backyard. Daniel tore it up and made way for his flowers, raising his garden up from the ground. His friends associated Daniel so closely with his garden that they had found it difficult to accept it had moved in with him. With so much time and money invested in his two projects, Daniel had kept that effort up to the present day. Running a house by himself, including a fully fledged garden, one that deserved the name, and whose flowers had won third place twice in local contests to prove it, was a second job. Another word for a garden, he said, to emphasize this point, was a plant nursery. Here he confused his terms somewhat. What he did was amateur gardening. A plant nursery aims to sell its plants for every conceivable need besides agriculture. His neighbors didn't know the difference and took him at his word. The first thing he did every morning was stretch. The second was to water his plants. On Monday he could do that with one hand on his breakfast and his other hand on his big watering can. He made 2 rounds from his sink to the flowers that stood in squat pots on his doorstep and on his porch, and when they were watered, that was all his gardening done for the day. On Tuesdays, it was worth the effort to get the hose, which he needed 2 hands to uncoil. It saved him countless trips to the sink. Tuesday's plants were in his backyard, in the garden proper. They were thirstier, and watering was a longer affair. Well, he was in no hurry. His garden was all flowers, not one fruit or vegetable among them. His trees were plain, green leaves and brown bark, no red and yellow apples for his friends to take with them as home-grown gifts. Had he given them those instead of wine, his friends would have likely gotten sick of them, a reaction they'd never have with wine, and been reminded of the distaste they would have developed when they saw the trees themselves. He could water them as he liked. Nothing would grow from them except more branches that held still more leaves to strengthen his defenses against the wind and against his neighbors' potentially prying eyes. Aside from the rogue critters that fled when they felt the hose spray, he had no pests to contend with. The death of an increasingly larger number of insect populations saved him money on pesticides. His friendliest animal visitors were the bees that came occasionally to pollinate his garden. To pipe water all the way from the city's reservoir, or wherever they got it from, it wasn't his job to know, and to get it into his house was an enormous price to pay for his hobby. It would have been more efficient and taken him less time if he'd set up an automated irrigation system. That was the city's latest investment, which it had made to reduce the responsibilities, and with them the pay, of the gardeners it employed to take care of its public parks. Daniel had discussed this with Malcolm, though the city hadn't put the decision up to a vote. Besides being taxpayers, they weren't personally affected and could be objective about it. It was perfectly reasonable for the city to make the switch because it cut labor costs and a catastrophe for the gardeners. And was a catastrophe because they were what was being cut into. Had Daniel gone to the expense of installing the same sprinklers, it would have made no financial difference, not in the short term, when the steep initial cost loomed over anyone considering it, and not in the long term, when the upkeep and repairs appeared and reappeared on the balance sheet, smaller than what had preceded them, but arriving more regularly. Emotionally, though, or spiritually, or however you want to name it, that change would have robbed him of a comparatively more valuable benefit. By tending to his garden, he established a routine. His feeling for when to water became second nature to him. It had something to do with muscle memory, too. He put what he used back in the shed, in the same place it had been earlier, and he could count on it being there when he wanted to find it again. Gradually, subconsciously, he began to relate each day of the week with what he watered. Had any of his neighbors gotten up as early as Daniel did, and had they felt an inexplicable urge to know what Daniel was doing, they would have looked over the tops of their fences and seen him watering his plants in his pajamas, raining the sandals he parked by his door, thus saving his house slippers from being worn outside and becoming as dirty as they were. The tools at his disposal included an array of watering cans and a hose that reached almost halfway around the house, running along the whole of his garden. Rainy days and hot days threw his system out of whack. He adjusted his plans with a lingering sense of unease. How much water a given plant had received and retained over the day depended on how hot the sun was and how hard the rain had fallen. His thermometer told him the temperature, while his window showed him the number of clouds in the sky, and if they were dark clouds, the rain that was coming down. Daniel and the weatherman spoke of the rain in inches, like so. We're expecting an inch of rain tomorrow, and 2 to 3 inches the day after that. Malcolm most often said it was raining like hell. If he had wrung out of hell all the emphasis it could muster for the time being, he made a lesser comparison. Daniel appointed his friends and neighbors as house-sitters when he went on vacation. He would tell them in advance, and whoever could make time for him in their days stepped up to take over his gardening, for which they received the spare keys to his house and shed. They, especially Malcolm, watered his garden conscientiously, according to his detailed instructions. He had written these down, and this proved useful the first time he entrusted them with his garden. 2 days after he had left, they realized they had a greater role to play in Daniel's vacation than saying goodbye and wishing him happy travels. It was gratifying for them to know how dependent the garden was on its gardeners, as helpless as a child. How dependent. They wanted to do him right, as he had with them, but they took that line of thought less stringently than they could have. A drizzle of rain or a cloudless sky didn't deter them. It wasn't their business to deviate from what they had laid out for them to do. Over water, under water, what did they care, and why should they fret? Daniel would find out how they had fared when he came back, and then he'd deal with it. They'd tell him they had done as he had asked, and he'd hear how they had temporarily hitched their own routines and lives to a small part of his. When Daniel was there, they walked with him through his garden on the stone path he had laid out, and overlooked the work it involved. When he was gone, they reacquainted themselves with what they had taken for granted, searching up the flowers he listed by name with the descriptions he supplied. These were scribbled in the margins as an Daniel had afterthought Daniel had had when it came to him that his neighbors lacked his interest in flowers, and the knowledge of his garden that came with it. They were the quick-to-wilt marsh marigolds, who bowed their heads in resentment to show how hurt they were from being forgotten for a day. He had planted them in the low places of the garden, so that rain would run down a modest incline and settle near them after a storm. This, and a system of daily watering, was how Daniel tried to simulate the wetness of a marsh, because the soil of his garden didn't live up to the flower's namesake habitat. For the marigolds, he wrote yellow clustered flowers. For his hardy bougainvillea, pink and shrub-like, has small white flowers hidden in its petals. He listed each plant's location and when and how much they should be watered. What he wrote was brief and sufficient for them to understand their duties. With each day that they did them, they began to know them by heart. This Saturday Daniel had met the Ashfords, Mr. Jonathan and Mrs. Maggie, who had called ahead on Friday. Could he make time for them at 2 o'clock tomorrow? For them, yes, of course. He'd have made time for any friends as dear as they, he said. He made each of his friends feel special by saying they were the exception. He felt the gesture retained some of its power even when you caught on to it, as the Ashfords had. They had talked not too long ago. A second visit meant their seeing him had more to it than a friendly hello. They knew what he had done for Malcolm. Daniel had bragged about his cleverness to the Ashfords, and to Malcolm's delight. And if he could get Malcolm a house for cheap, an extraordinary ask, and a challenge Daniel had met well, he could surely give their trouble a try. They came empty-handed. Daniel forgave them wordlessly and gave them glasses of champagne, the weakest drink he had on hand besides tap water. Jonathan took his glass. Maggie shook her head. "It won't kill you," Daniel said. She shook her head again and underlined the motion with a softly spoken, "No, thank you." At a party, Daniel might have made a joke about people like her, who were determined to stay sober, but this clarity of mind was, upon further reflection, what they needed for the problems they had brought to him. There was, nevertheless, something to say for drinking, that it lifted their spirits and made them feel that the solving of the problems was a matter of minimal effort. To make it plain, he got them tipsy to open them up. "Come on," Daniel said. Jonathan held his glass in his delicate fingers, and, in his mouth, he held the one sip he'd had the time to take. "I'll show you what I've been up to." The three of them strolled around the garden. Daniel pointed to what had changed since their last visit, and explained what they were supposed to notice, if they couldn't see it for themselves. For Daniel, the garden's transformation had taken place gradually, over a long period of time, and the difference was stark. The Ashfords hadn't seen how his marigolds had struggled, and couldn't appreciate their bloom as he did. It did the Ashfords good to see Daniel and to have a change of scenery from the over-familiar sights of their house to his home, of which his garden was, in this case, the most important part. It and his tool shed were in a state of constant, slow change. He moved the flowers that had outgrown their pots into bigger ones, and moved those whom no pot could hold into an open plot in the ground. Some were already in the ground and had grown to such heights that they cast shadows over the plants next to them, depriving them of their share of sunlight. If not for Daniel's intervention, and barring the possibility of an accident, the taller of the two flowers would have suffocated the smaller, and made it the loser of their silent competition. He cut these plants down to a manageable size with his pruning shears, and when he found it necessary, he dug them up and replanted them somewhere that he wouldn't bully the smaller plants. He wore gloves for this, because he had tried to do without them and learned why he shouldn't. He had learned a similar lesson trying to dig a hole with his bare hands. He'd looked up and down his shed for a shovel or a spade, and found neither. He knew what they were there for, but they weren't there. He hadn't needed them before that day, and why should that ever change? He had scraped at the dirt and come away with handfuls of it, of which a great part was under his fingernails. After minutes of work, he was astonished to see how slow he was making progress, and how hard it was to dig a small hole for the flowers he was replanting. He went out to buy a shovel and bought a spade too for good measure. In the time he was out of the house, the ground must have become much softer than it had been at his first attempt. He found unexpected pleasure in feeling the ground surrender more easily to the shovel blade than to his hands. He was relieved to have a solution, and felt stupid for overthinking things. Had he let nature take its course rather than keep it in check with his trimming, the trees in his yards would have lost their branches to gravity when they grew too heavy to rely on the support of the trunk. The trees stood close to his neighbors' fences, and their branches would have crossed the property line eventually. There was a chance that his neighbors, genial though they were, would respond by sawing the branches off themselves, and quarrel with him about it. Malcolm was grateful, but not a pushover, and neither were the Dumas family, who lived in the house to his left. They got along. And Daniel wanted it to stay that way, so he made sure he did nothing they could find fault in. Had his pruning shears gone missing, or had they gotten lost underneath his armory of tools, he could have resorted to snapping the branches off to keep the peace. He talked to make up for the Ashford silence and their reticence to say what was on their minds. At long last, Maggie came out with it, Paul's being held back in school. She slipped this news of their son into the conversation, as if to tell Daniel that she didn't want to talk about it, but that she felt it should be mentioned, although she and her husband quickly found the nerve to go on. Their roles reversed. The Ashfords talked, Daniel nodded and punctuated the ends of their sentences with grunts and by saying, "Right," or "I see." Daniel had met Paul a couple times and knew what his weak subjects were, math and French. In math, he had barely escaped a failing grade. In French, he had hit a snag. The rest of his report card was far better. Not perfect, not stellar, but well above passing. A bad test in those subjects, Jonathan said, had brought him down, not ruined him. As for French, one good test couldn't offset his failures. He'd have to repeat his freshman year of high school. It's nothing to be proud of, but it would be worse if this were his senior year, Daniel consoled them. His classmates would be at their graduation, and he'd be at home kicking himself. The day they found out, his parents asked him how this could have happened. He was as shocked as they were. His parents were disappointed in their son and blamed themselves for not checking in on him as they should have. Paul sulked, his shame nakedly visible on his face, having nothing to say in his defense. The Ashfords strove to be straightforward in their retelling of events. A few scenes had holes right through them and gaps in between, which Daniel filled with his imagination. Had the Ashfords really kept their composure, as they said, or had they clutched their heads, paced in circles, and thrown their arms about them? Today, Paul was home alone, and because he was alone, Daniel's mind added that the house was dark to complete the picture. Paul was feeling guilty and studying for all the good it did him after he'd handed in his final tests and papers for markings. Jonathan chimed in. They had hired tutors and were sending Paul to summer school. He could start making up for the time he lost right away. He's in good hands, I say, Daniel said. We'll see how it goes, Maggie murmured, her mouth forming into a weak smile. To Daniel, the idea that their son could somehow skip a year and get back together with his former classmates was delusional. They wanted there to be a way for him to overcome this setback and make it as if it hadn't happened. He turned to Maggie. Focus on what you can do. Don't think about the far future, and don't pin your hopes on it either. Maybe his school will put him on a fast track to senior year, probably not. Jonathan defended his wife. She's not saying it's certain, but we want what's best for him. Daniel was taken aback and spoke in short, halting sentences. I know that. Don't put words in my mouth. And don't get mad at me for what I didn't say. There was a pause. Daniel tried to be upbeat and smooth things over with a bit of comic seriousness. Look, he'll know what's on the test ahead of time. He'll be a step behind his peers and a head above his class. Another weak smile, this time from Jonathan and Maggie both. Daniel refilled Jonathan's glass and looked to Maggie to see if she was sure about her sobriety. She was. No, I can't. I have to drive, she said, anticipating what he would say, and therefore removing his need to say it. You gave him, too. They went home soon after. They lived in another neighborhood and could do nothing as immediate as tending to his garden to repay him, nor had they bought presents. With the Ashfords' departure, it seemed to Daniel that his garden was emptier with him alone than it had been full with 3 people. He couldn't fix their son in 1 afternoon, or in 10. He couldn't solve their problems for them, and didn't want to. What he could do was nudge them in the right direction. That was A Second Opinion, written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along to the stories, you can find a link to that in the description of this video. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you, and until next time.